I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of Astral Affairs Rambova, and I want to read my book to you. Her years as Valentino's wife. Why Natacharambovas marriage to the greatest of screen idols came to a tragic end, by Herbhowe, published in the New Movie magazine December 1929 to May 1930. Passing the Vesuvio, an obscure little Italian restaurant in the basement of a brownstone, front directly behind the Capitol Theater, New York, I was stopped by gusts of memory. It was here I often lunched and dined with Rudy Valentino, who with characteristic sentiment remained loyal to the place long after fame offered him its caviar. Memory drawn, I turned and went down the few steps to the arched entrance beneath the stairs that led to the floor above. The one window of the place gazed at me lifelessly, shrouded in curtains a little soiled. Faint eddies of dust whirled on the stone pavement in the corner by the door as if they were also seeking entrance. A few folded papers, soggy and stained and dead, lay there. Across the arched opening under the stairs, an iron lattice grating had been drawn so that the vestibule to the inner door was dark and hollow, like a tomb. The grating was padlocked. It, too, was gone. In the still dreariness, I recalled our last meeting there. I had come alone to dine on the good but cheap table d'hôte. There were several diners in the place, mostly Italians and their girls. I took a small table by the kitchen door where I could exchange words with the plump signora who emerged steaming from time to time to look over her guests. I had come to know her through Rudy. He always exchanged banter and Italian compliments with her. The waiter was in the act of placing my plate of minestrone when a hush fell on the room like a stroke of paralysis. The plate of soup remained suspended beneath my nose as though the waiter had turned to bronze, and the spoons and forks of other diners were similarly transfixed in mid-air. The whole room was stricken by the opening of the outer door. "Buonasera," called the husky voice of the signora, coming out of the kitchen to greet the arrivals. "Buonasera, signora." "Come sta?" boomed the reply. And then the same voice, "Hello, Herb, come have dinner with us." Rudy had entered, working his usual spell, and with him Natasha, his wife, and Natasha's white-haired aunt, to whom Rudy was so devoted that in his last will he named her affectionately his beneficiary. I moved to their table and tried to feel at ease among the surrounding waxworks. Rudy never appeared conscious of stares. He enjoyed attention and accepted it with lusty naturalness where other stars are rendered coyly artificial. The other people in the restaurant recognized the Valentinos, of course, but their eyes, the only mobile parts left them, turned queryingly on me. I spilled my soup with hands that behaved as if in husking mittens. Apparently my identity had to be explained to spare me the inconvenience of developing apoplexy. "If they don't stop staring," I said, my complexion ripening to mauve, "I shall arise and announce I'm the late John Bunny, staging a comeback." Rudy released a hearty guffaw, and the diners thawed. The dinner went merrily with Natasha's wit. Rudy had a huge appetite for humor, as well as for food. That was our last dinner, a vivid memory. Turning from the bleak little ristorante, barred and sealed, its own mausoleum, I vowed to find Natasha at once, and lunch and laugh once more. Natacharambova. The name in letters of stone appear above a shop next to Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street. Rich fabrics and pieces of antique jewelry are in the window, beyond in which your curious gaze is lost, folds of gauzy green. I opened the door. In the center of a spacious salon, modernistically spare, with furnishings of silver and burgundy, stood that dominant, regal girl, dressed in black velvet, her small head turbaned in flame, with braids of brown hair coiled close to her ears. The girl who, in her own words, had been called everything from Messalina to a dope fiend. I expected to find her restrained. A volume of tragedy has been written since that night we parted over the gay Italian meal. Unmercifully flayed after her separation from Rudy, she went for seclusion to her mother in France. She re-emerged briefly at the time of Rudy's death, then disappeared again. I knew there had been shabby years. People reported seeing her now and then on the avenue. She was always alone, dressed severely plainly, but her head was held high by that indomitable will of hers. She tried many things: vaudeville, dancing classes, writing, decorating. Finally a small shop, then success in a larger one. All the friends of her opulent hour passed her by long ago. Her clientele had been built solely on her art as designer, and is strictly Park Avenue, without a stage or screen celebrity. Even her worst enemy has admitted the genius of Natasha, that unquenchable flame of ambition that sweeps out from her ruthlessly to combat Hollywood and its intrigues with implacable instinct and a fighting spirit of Amazonian fierceness. Yet for all her electric vitality, I think Natasha's spirit is a little weary. Very young, she has witnessed with shrewd eyes the mockery of the world's spectacle, and from the highest throne of idolatry this age has known, she has experienced its sharp irony. I recalled the days I spent in her apartment collaborating with Rudy on his life story. Because of some legal technicality pertaining to his divorce from Jean Acker, he and Natasha were forced to maintain separate apartments for several months after their marriage in Mexico. But of course Rudy spent his time in Natasha's. There was a moment of constraint as Natasha and I sat down on the divan. To break it, I referred to the hours spent on his life story. Now we ought to do your life, I said. But I guess all your real names have been told. Yes, and I've been called a lot of names that weren't mine, laughed Natasha. No, I'm here to tell you right now that I don't give a hang for publicity. God knows there's been too much of it for me already. I've been called everything from Messalina to a dope fiend. Did you feel it much? I asked. I was tortured. I was tortured to agony, she said. Her eyes met mine in an eloquence of silence. In that minute, the interval of years passed by. I felt certain I knew her as I hadn't before. She turned the poignancy of the revelation with a quick laugh. I always loved the laughter of Natasha. It was clear and gay, and it can shield a multitude of sorrows with its courage. They even said I have no sense of humor. Her laugh mounted. That's equivalent to saying I'm dead. Without it, I would have been long ago. Those who said it couldn't have known that her real name is O'Shaughnessy. No more did those who thought to defeat her. In the Hollywood days, the studio rang with her battles for Rudy, his stories, his salary, his costumes. Oh, I was a fool, she exclaimed with a rueful smile. But I was young and optimistic and full of fight. I didn't realize the uselessness. I was butting my head against a wall. They didn't care about your ideas or about you. They want to crowd as many pictures into as little time as possible, to collect on you as swiftly as they can. What happens to the star is of no concern. I can't think of any position more difficult than that of an idol's wife, I said. It was hellish, she affirmed. Rudy hadn't one faint gleam of business sense. He knew he hadn't and relied on me. He was a big, sweet, trusting child who wanted to be loved above all things, and that desire to be liked by everyone left him open to imposition. He would agree to anything to be agreeable. When he realized he'd made a mistake, I rushed into them shouting, "No!" And you know how popular that word is in Hollywood. This, of course, gave them a fine weapon against me. Everyone knew Rudy was sweet and agreeable at all times. Therefore, if anyone suffered, it was because of Mrs. Valentino. A girl would be presented for a part. Perhaps she was 5'8", and the part called for a kitten. I would say I couldn't see her as the type. The girl was dismissed. Mrs. Valentino didn't like you. It was fiendish. Yet I felt I was necessary. Rudy felt I was, you know that. But he had pride, a legitimate man's pride, and they worked on that. They commenced bringing him clippings, which said, Mrs. Valentino wears the pants. Too bad Rudy can't be his own boss, and so forth and so forth. These rankled. Eventually, if I so much as observed it was a nice day, Rudy, about to agree, would catch himself and say, no, it's not. Of course I realized how he felt. He didn't want to be putty, even in his wife's hands. We would laugh about the clippings. Nevertheless, they made a wedge. Rudy was frightfully sensitive. He couldn't stand the least criticism. And being an actor, a much finer actor than most people realized, he was pliant. If I shaped some of his convictions, I at least had his interest at heart. Others at the studio, the clippings bearers, for instance, did not. They imposed on him in every way conceivable. They borrowed money, they took his time, they sold his stuff, and one of his closest friends, I discovered, was speculating in the market with his money. A trusting soul, if there ever was one, it was dreadful to open Rudy's eyes to people who appeared so nice to him, who he thought liked him. I would kill off one crop of sycophants, and so help me, the next morning there would be another. I never saw anything to equal it. They sprang up overnight like toadstools. Only a person who has experienced Hollywood would believe me. They not only wanted to get in his good graces, each wanted to monopolize him utterly. And when they couldn't, they said I did. Oh, I tell you, it was sweet for me. She laughed a little ruefully. I can't understand how I ever could have been so foolish as to let it wear me down, but it did. You lose perspective. It's inevitable that you lose it. They force you out of your mind. Perhaps if you could go through it first and then go back, but you have to go through it to know. You simply cannot keep your perspective. Another thing, I didn't want to go to parties. I'm not a particularly sociable mortal. I didn't care for society and didn't go before, and I couldn't see any reason for going after we were in a certain position. That, of course, did not endear me with people who wanted the Valentinos for showpieces at their affairs. I didn't care if I was unpopular, but it hurt Rudy to be. Deeply ingrained in him was the desire for popularity, to be liked. I remember the first day he came onto the set, I disliked him. At that time I was very serious, running about in low-heeled shoes and taking squints at my sets and costumes. Rudy was forever telling jokes and forgetting the point of them, and I thought him plain dumb. Natasha laughed. Then it came over me suddenly one day that he was trying to please me, to ingratiate himself with his absurd jokes. Of course I capitulated. Oh, the poor child, I thought. He just wants to be liked. He's lonely. And, well, you know what that sentiment leads to. End quote. Rudy was lonely. I never knew a lonelier man. He craved affection so. I remember the first time he spoke Natasha's name to me. We had had dinner in his one-room and kitchenette apartment in the Formosa. He had engaged a woman to come in and serve for the occasion, and it was wistfully festive. I had done the first stories about him. He was deeply grateful. Hollywood for him was a forlorn place until his success was firmly decided. They looked upon him as a dubious Italian with sleek hair, who had been a tango dancer in a cabaret, who was pathetically poor and altogether of no consequence in film society. Even after New York recognized him as an artist in The Four Horsemen, Hollywood sat back in its own provincial smugness and had to be shown. Rudy showed me some of his first notices proudly. While I was waxing sincerely fervent over his prospects, he tentatively ventured the name of Natacharambova. Had I heard of her? I hadn't. She was doing some really remarkable sets, he said. He thought her a fine artist. Perhaps my magazine might be interested in some of her drawings to publish. His suggestion was so timorous I gave no importance to it. On another evening, some time later, as we sat until the revealing hours of morning over coffee in a downtown cafe, he told me, quote, "She is a wonderful girl, very much alone like myself. I go to her house evenings and we talk about things that interest us, things that don't seem to interest many people here, books, new plays, the modern art movement, and of course our work. Our tastes are very similar. It is just a friendship which I need very much. I don't know where it will lead. I hope it will keep on growing." End quote. Then after their marriage, quote, "There was nothing mad or hysterical about our love. It commenced slowly in friendship, as I told you, and just blossomed naturally. She gives me companionship, sincere and sympathetic companionship, the thing I have always longed for, the thing a man needs above all else to complete himself." End quote. Their separation was one of the many great tragedies that may be laid at the gates of Hollywood, most worldly of places on earth today. For the idol, it is a garden of many blandishments, the irony of which, continually repeated, leads to dizziness, if not destruction. I do not believe Natasha ever departed from the mind of Rudy, nor actually from his heart. He was proud, he had been wounded, and was confused. Yet when he was ill, his thoughts must have hovered over their associations, for he named with deep affection her aunt, who was a symbol of them, in his will. "It was Hollywood that separated you," I said to Natasha. She only nodded. "Do you think it possible for two people to succeed with marriage there?" I asked. "Not just ostensibly, I mean, but actually. Or even with great friendship." "The only possibility, I think," she said, "would be if they kept entirely out of it all, and recognized it for what it's worth. But that's it. You are young, appearances are deceptive, you don't realize you're losing perspective and being absorbed until you are swallowed up. Hollywood is a hotbed of malice. It seethes and boils in envy. Never a good word is spoken of anyone unless for publicity or to gain some personal end. Sweet words of flattery have vinegar on their breath. Eyes of malevolence watch you, and even as you turn, you feel the tearing tongues of backbiters. People go places out of fear. Fear is on parade. Fear of being forgotten if you are not in the procession. Fear of being talked about if you stay away. And fear of the ravening critical eyes when you are present. It's a terrible place. Thank God I'm out of it all." She spoke with mirthful detachment, even of Hollywood, with an amused mockery that embraced herself. "It's like the war," I said. "You can laugh at it all when it's over." "Exactly," she said, "and particularly at your own ridiculous self taking it so seriously. And you will never return?" "Well, hardly. I haven't heard from anyone there, and never expect to." The telephone rang in interruption. "Who is it?" she asked the assistant. "Some studio. I don't get the name." Natasha was aghast. "Can you beat that? Speak of the devil. And you brought this on." She went to the phone. "Believe me or not," she said, returning, "they called to ask me where the Beaucaire costumes are that I designed 6 years ago. Beat that. How in the world should I know where their costumes are?" "You'll have to go back, Natasha," I said solemnly. "You'll have to go back and find those costumes for them, or they'll add thief to your string of names." But Natasha was reduced to muttering astonishment and didn't heed me. Now what on earth possessed them to call me? How did they know where I was? My heavens! Last year Natasha designed the sets and costumes for the American Opera at the Champs-Élysées Theatre in Paris. They received the marked attention of artists and critics. It was suggested that she should return to the cinema as an art director. "You were ahead of your time before," they said. "Yes, I'm always ahead of my time and getting kicked out for it," mused Natasha. "Never again." "No, sir. I'm content sitting right here," she said, glancing around her shop. "I am a businesswoman, and I shall continue to be one until—" A transient shadow passed over her eyes, a trifle weary, and I knew the vaulting spirit of Natasha had touched futility, until I can go off and live in an adobe shack with some books, at the end of nowhere. She looked at me now. The amused expression she had maintained through the conversation faded out. "I'm glad Rudy died when he did, while the world still adored him. The death of his popularity would have been 1,000 deaths to him. Rudy belonged to the age of romance. He brought it with him. It went with him. I think it was a climax he would have wished for. I'm sure of it." I said, He died still in that fabulous dream of romance, such as few men on earth have had. So the tragedy of awakening was averted. And I believe the last words he would have spoken were those that wrung our hearts in The Four Horsemen, the words of Julio dying in a trench in France. Je suis content. I am happy.